You're listening to Skate of Thrones, your go-to podcast for dialed-in LA Kings coverage.
How's it going, everyone, and welcome to Skate of Thrones, the podcast that dials in on the Los Angeles Kings. I'm your host, Casey Casliner, here on this Monday night as we take a look at the Kings' 5-1 loss to the Pittsburgh Penguins, just an utter blowout from Crypto.com Arena. And it was the Kings' first home game since January 4th. Of course, they had one scheduled on the 8th, but we all know what's going on right now in the city of Los Angeles. A very tragic time for the city, and with the wildfires and everything going on, it was an emotional game for the Kings, heading back home after a 5-game road trip, and they had first responders, firefighters, fans that were affected at the game, and the Kings have been a very good home team this year. As we know, they would have liked to have a good showing on home ice, with a 14-3-1 record now on home ice, but the Kings just really couldn't get their offense or defense rolling from the start. The Penguins scored in all 3 periods, and honestly, there's not much you can say other than the Kings didn't stick to their game, and Anze Kopitar, the captain, of course, the leader of this franchise, he talked about it a lot in the press conference. They can't make excuses with everything going on. It's a very tragic time. They have to just stick to their game, and they have to kind of block out the noise, and they really didn't do that tonight. They sort of just didn't stick to their game, didn't play simply, and as a result, you're going to lose 5-1 when you don't stick to your game. But I think we should also look at some of their recent games because, of course, games like this can be a one-off, but the Kings' offense has dipped off a lot in recent games. They've lost 4 of their last 5, with that lone outlier being a win over Vancouver, 5-1, a very good game for them offensively, especially for Alex Turcotte. But they lose 4-2 against Seattle on Saturday in a game where they start slow and finish strong. They lose 2 in Alberta prior to the Vancouver win, and that stretch in Alberta was very tough, of course, combining for just 1 goal in those 2 games. And so my point is the Kings' offense has just not been itself, and the Kings have been a generally consistent team this year. They're not a team that likes to lose back-to-back games. Their only losing streak of 3 or more was at the beginning of the year. They've been very consistent, very good, especially on home ice. And it just seems like recently they've changed a bit. And, of course, I want to mention that Alex Laferriere and Drew Doughty were seen in non-contact jerseys in morning skate. Those red jerseys signified that, they're on their way back. They're not quite there yet. They're skating. Of course, Laferriere injured recently and is a big part of the team's offense. But I should mention that, of course, leading up to his injury, his offensive production sort of dropped off a little bit, as did the team's. But, Laferriere has been one of the leaders on this team. He has 13 goals this year, 13 assists. He's been a very good offensive player for the team. And, his absence, of course, is big for the Kings, a team that operates using the 11-7 method right now with, 1 more defenseman. But Laferriere being out, shouldn't be the full blame, as, of course, the whole team right now just seems to be in a slump. Now, Doughty coming back soon, hopefully, for the Kings is encouraging. Like I said, the 11-7 makes the defensive pairings kind of interesting, so we'll see how he slots in when he does return. And for Jim Hiller and company, they'll want him back as soon as possible. We know the Kings' identity is sort of hard-nosed, hard defense, and Doughty brings that undoubtedly. He's done that his whole career. So, of course, a game where the Kings wanted to win. I mean, they want to win every game, but especially one like this where, they're back home for the first time in a while. The Kings rolled out with a generally same lineup as the one against Seattle, really the same forwards and defensemen. The only change was David Rittich in goal in place of Darcy Kemper. And, of course, Darcy Kemper has been very good in recent games. Of course, the team, though, has sort of lacked that ability to, get rolling early, and that's been really tough for the goaltenders. But I will say that, David Rittich tonight just didn't seem like he was completely in this game. Pittsburgh had a few goals that, you thought to yourself, well, okay, they're good goals, but, the Kings really probably could have done more there to stop them, especially the first goal. And we'll get into those goals in a moment, but it was just a tough one from the jump. The Kings didn't really have a strong, crisp start to this game, and it cost them down the stretch, as we saw last game against Seattle as well. I also want to mention Samuel Helenius really quickly because Jim Hiller talked about in the press conference Helenius getting some extra shifts at the end of the game, and he put Quinton Byfield on the wing. Of course, Helenius is one of those guys who's going to grind for every puck battle. He's going to do a lot that you don't necessarily see on the stat sheet, and I think that's interesting to point out considering, Jim Hiller seems like a coach who is not only defensively minded, but is really passionate about the little things. And Quinton Byfield, obviously Jim Hiller said he didn't mean to single out Byfield, but he sort of mentioned that Byfield has been kind of, not only inconsistent, but just sometimes not completely in the game, not in the action. He doesn't make himself involved. And of course, we know that he's a streaky player. At one point, he had 6 goals in a 7-game stretch, and he's just been very shaky these past few games, just 1 assist in the last 7 games. And so I think really for Byfield, he had a nice sort of screen look on that goal that Adrian Kempe scored in this one, the lone goal for the Kings. But it'll be interesting to see, especially toward the end of games where the Kings are either up by a lot or down by a lot, to see like what Jim Hiller does, because I think that really shows, his decision making and what he puts trust in down the stretch. And we know that Quinton Byfield has been inconsistent, but I think it's just one thing to look at, as we head into the second half of the season. So the Penguins at one point in this game were up 3-0. Kevin Hayes scored the first goal, sort of a lucky goal. He clearly didn't do what he was trying to do. Joel Edmondson for the Kings, poke checked him, and the puck skid past Riddick into the net. And so that was just a little mistake. It didn't seem like it would be, too costly at the time. It's 1 goal, but, the Penguins just thrived off of momentum. 4 minutes later, Sidney Crosby scores his 13th of the year off a tip from the point. Go to the second period, Malkin scores. Adrian Kempe scores the lone goal for the Kings in the loss. It's a power play goal on a 5-on-3 assist to Anze Kopitar and Jordan Spence. And Anze Kopitar, I think really, to the standard that, the media and fans hold him to, did not play very well in this game, all things considered. Just didn't seem like he was super involved on offense, and especially for a center, a captain, a guy who, really just has been the face of the franchise. It was kind of surprising to see, but he does get a primary assist. Jordan Spence gets a secondary, and he's been playing a lot better lately. I thought, there were points of the season where Spence was almost a liability, it seemed, but he's been better lately. Of course, had the nice goal against Seattle. He's been playing a lot better on defense, has that assist tonight. And Kempe has the goal, hits the post the first time around, gets the puck back, hits the post again, back into the net, and off the one-timer, Adrian Kempe has just been a godsend for the Kings, now up to 23 goals on the year to lead the team. But the Kings go on the 5-on-4 after the 5-on-3 because of the goal, and they can't capitalize. And then at the end of the period with a minute left, Cody Glass scores. It's 4-1, and at that point, the Kings have all the life sucked out of them. And finally, in the third period, Anthony Beauvillier scores, and that pretty much seals the nail in the coffin. 5-1, our final score. So that was a quick recap of what happened. And it's interesting because the Penguins are obviously a weaker team defensively. But tonight, it just seemed like not only were the Kings getting forechecked really hard and dominated in their own zone, but it just seemed like they were lacking cohesion on both ends of the ice. I want to talk about some players that, maybe stand out from a lack of kind of involvement. We talked about Quinton Byfield a little bit in that respect, but Trevor Lewis, of course, returning from injury recently, of course, hasn't seen the ice that much in the past few weeks because of that injury, but he has just been, pretty unproductive for the Kings, not really generating many high danger chances. He had a look in front of the crease in this game, couldn't get it to poke through. And so that was interesting. I also want to look at Brandt Clarke as well, because he was, of course, just an absolute big storyline for the Kings heading into this season. Of course, showed some flashes last year, had, games this year where not only was he scoring goals, but he was putting up shots. He had, 5 to 6 shots in certain games early on in the year, but recently he's only really putting up 1 to 2 shots. And Jim Hiller last game put Brandt Clarke on the wing to sort of jolt his offense a bit. But it just seems like it's not really there right now for Brandt Clarke. And it'll be interesting to see how his defensive game develops right now for the Kings, considering they're a team that, has seen their defensive production kind of halt a little bit after being so good. And Clarke is, we all know, is an offensive defenseman, but he still, of course, wants to grow his game more. He's young, and so that's one thing to think about. The Kings' schedule coming up is very difficult. Of course, playing the defending Cup champs Florida on Wednesday. Then on Saturday, a Columbus team that, is hot and can do damage. Then you play Detroit, a team that, can steal a win here and there. And then Florida again, Tampa, Carolina. I mean, these aren't easy games, and the Kings are going to want to fix this funk as soon as possible. So definitely not a cakewalk for the Kings. Talked about this a moment ago, but the Kings' power play has 3 goals in its last 3 games. But, of course, for the Kings, they've been relied on a certain few familiar faces scoring those power play goals. 3 players have at least 3 power play goals this year. It just hasn't been spread around that much. And of course, Kevin Fiala for the Kings, wildly kind of a polarizing player on this team with, how his discipline has sort of been a hindering factor of his game, but he is a guy that can score goals. And so I want to see how he wakes up on the power play, with the team kind of struggling in that regard. But importantly, it just feels right now, beyond everything, beyond the offense not being what it is, the defensive core is just not itself. Because for the Kings, they can sort of bank on their defense being there to shut down the chances. But it just feels right now that a lot of these guys are missing assignments, not in the right positions. Mikey Anderson tonight, I thought, he missed a few assignments. I wrote that down in my notes. Vladislav Gavrikov, is sometimes, just not in the right position, not really the hard-nosed player they need. And he's had, some really good games this year, so I don't want to discredit that. But, I think for the Kings recently, I've been really impressed by Spence, who I mentioned earlier, but Jacob Muvarari, of course, playing with Spence has been good. I thought Muvarari tonight wasn't amazing, so I want to see how, when Drew Doughty comes back, if that shakes up anything. But that should be, one aspect of the Kings game that they want to just bolster to the fullest extent, because the offense, if they don't make a trade, is not going to probably grow any further than it is right now, barring any, big breakouts maybe from Byfield or someone else. But if I've learned one thing in covering the Kings, they're a response team. It'll be interesting to see how they come out against a slate of tough opponents. And, it was just an off game all around. I don't know if you can judge this game too hard, maybe how you would judge other games. It's a team they don't play too often. Sidney Crosby has the ability to do things that, other players don't, and he's unpredictable sometimes. And so, maybe the Kings were just stunned. They weren't expecting this back on home ice. They have to get back familiar to the home cooking. But I want to see how Jim Hiller operates, down the stretch, moving pieces around, especially with the 11-7, having the ability to kind of shake things up. This was the Kings' 4th loss of the year by 4 or more goals, most recently against San Jose on November 25th. So it's been a while since they've suffered a blowout, and this is a tough one to endure it. I also want to mention, sort of out-of-town scoreboard, but the Edmonton Oilers, of course, ahead of the Kings in the Pacific, but Connor McDavid undergoing a 3-game suspension coming up. And so I want to see, how the Kings can sort of maybe keep that in mind going forward with, they have a chance now to cover some ground in the Pacific. So that'll be interesting. Of course, not playing Edmonton till the end of the season. And so, every kind of game matters for both of these teams. Of course, it feels inevitable that they're going to play each other in the playoffs for the 4th season in a row. But we will see what happens there with some tough opponents coming up for the Oilers. But to summarize everything, the Penguins played perfectly from the start. The Kings were slumping in a funk, it seemed, and they just couldn't respond when it was all said and done. Probably the worst home game of the season for the Kings. No denying that. They've been a team that's just been so good on home ice. But I think they just honestly have to check harder. They have to be more aware in the offensive zone of where their passes are going to go, avoid the turnovers, play better in the neutral zone. There's a lot of things they need to fix. But when it's all said and done, I want to see how they respond to the adversity, going forward. And it's a tight race in the division. So we will see how they execute going forward. And that's going to pretty much wrap things up for the first episode of Skate of Thrones. If you like this, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. We'll have some more Kings coverage coming your way soon. But I'm Casey Kasliner. Hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next one.